They thought she was just another nurse on a quiet night shift. No rank, no backup, no warning of what was about to happen. When armed intruders stormed the ICU, everyone froze, except her. In seconds, the hospital turned into a battlefield she refused to abandon. What happened next made even the trained men behind her stop and stare. The night shift at St. Mary's ICU was supposed to be quiet. Too quiet, some would say. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting pale pools over the rows of beds where patients lay in stillness. Machines beeped rhythmically, as if keeping their own secret time, and the occasional hiss of oxygen broke the silence. She adjusted her gloves, tightened her ponytail, and walked down the corridor with careful, precise steps. To everyone else, she was just another nurse. Nothing remarkable, nothing threatening, just a woman in blue scrubs, moving efficiently from bed to bed, checking 4S, adjusting monitors, wiping down surfaces, and making mental notes about each patient's condition. She had been doing this job for years, yet tonight there was a sense that the calm she was used to had been replaced by something else, an unease she couldn't shake. Earlier that evening, a security guard had smiled at her near the entrance. "Busy night ahead?" he asked, adjusting his cap. She had nodded politely, smiled faintly, and passed him by. She rarely interacted with anyone beyond a nod or a brief word. Small talk wasn't her style. Complaining about long shifts or fatigue was a luxury she didn't allow herself. She had learned long ago that work like this required focus, discipline, and emotional control. She observed, she adapted, and she survived. Inside the ICU, the patients were a mixture of conscious and unconscious, awake and sleeping, some struggling against pain they couldn't voice. She knew every monitor's rhythm, every beep's implication. She could tell which heart rate spike was dangerous, which oxygen fluctuation was serious, and which equipment was malfunctioning. Awareness was her weapon, knowledge, her shield. And tonight, she felt that awareness prickling, alerting her that something was off. It started subtly, a vibration beneath her feet, almost imperceptible. She paused, listening. Then came the sound, metal scraping against concrete. A crash echoed far down the hall, monitors beeped erratically. Her own pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. Another crash. And then a scream, abruptly cut off, reverberated through the corridor. She stiffened, knowing immediately that this wasn't random. Someone, or something, had entered the hospital with intent. Not theft, not chaos, targeted, precise, deadly. She moved silently toward the source, crouching slightly, her eyes scanning every shadow. Her hands hovered near a small, unmarked emergency case she had kept tucked under the supply cart. Most nurses wouldn't even know it existed. Inside were tools, defensive measures, emergency gear she had never wanted to use but had always prepared for. Tonight, it would be necessary. The first figures appeared at the far end of the hall, armed, tactical, moving in coordinated steps, faces masked, voices low, commanding. Their boots echoed against the tile, each sound sharp, deliberate. They had a plan. And they didn't expect her. She stayed in the shadows, invisible, observing, counting, calculating. One man kicked a gurney aside carelessly. Another pointed his weapon, scanning the room with practiced precision. The intruders were confident, arrogant even. They assumed the ICU was defenseless, that the staff would panic and flee. They were wrong, dead wrong. The lights flickered. Alarms began to sound, silent to the intruders, deafening to the nurses and patients. One of the attackers laughed, a cruel sound that made her jaw tighten. Panic was everywhere except in her. She moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the nearest patient. Every step was measured. Every motion was controlled. The chaos around her didn't rattle her. It sharpened her senses. One intruder noticed her. Just for a moment. He scoffed. "Just a nurse," he muttered under his breath. And in that moment, she knew everything. He had underestimated her. That mistake would cost him. She struck before he could react. Quick, precise, silent. One instant, then he was down, motionless. Another charged, thinking he could flank her. She anticipated, moved, and neutralized him before he reached her. The corridor erupted into chaos. Shouts, gunfire, and alarms filled the air. Yet through it all she maintained a rhythm, a calm she didn't quite understand herself, years of training, of experience. In life-or-death situations she hadn't spoken about. Guided her. She didn't panic. She never had. And she never would. She shielded patients as she moved from bed to bed, repositioning them, pulling them behind, carts, using whatever she could as cover. Blood stained the floor in her scrubs, but she didn't flinch. Pain was irrelevant. Fear was irrelevant. Only the mission mattered: protect the ward, neutralize the threat, survive, and survive she would. Outside, security teams were mobilizing. Helicopters thundered overhead, searchlights cutting through the night mist, illuminating the hospital facade. Reinforcements were coming. But inside, she was alone. The intruders were trained, dangerous, but not prepared for her. Not prepared for the precision, the discipline, the unexpected ferocity of someone who refused to be just a nurse. By the time the attackers realized she was no ordinary nurse, it was too late. One by one, they fell. Every misstep, every moment of hesitation, she punished. She moved like a shadow, striking with the efficiency of someone who had survived far worse than anyone in this hospital had ever known. Every gunshot she returned, every maneuver she made was calculated. She didn't make mistakes, she didn't hesitate, and she didn't stop. The corridor fell eerily silent again. Monitors beeped steadily. Patients breathed. She stood in the dim light, scanning the halls, counting the intruders, listening for the next sound. This was only the beginning. The night was far from over. The first intruder hit the floor before he even realized she had moved. A single, precise strike, silent but decisive, and he crumpled among the overturned gurneys and scattered medical supplies. Another tried to charge her, weapon raised, but she was already repositioning, moving through the ICU with the agility of someone who had long ago learned to read chaos as if it were a map. Every footstep, every breath, every blink counted. She was aware of everything: the machines, the beds, the monitors, even the faint creak of a vent cover overhead. Her heart remained steady, her hands did not shake. Fear had no place here. Shouts erupted behind her as more attackers poured into the ward, expecting to find nurses cowering, doctors begging, patients screaming. Instead, they found one woman standing in the center, calm, composed, and deadly. Blue scrubs now streaked with blood, hers and theirs, clung to her as she pivoted behind an overturned four-stand, using it as cover. Bullets smashed into the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The metallic ping of ricochets echoed through the hall. A nurse had screamed somewhere, a warning that didn't matter. She had eyes and instincts for everything that mattered. "Lock it down, she's trained," one intruder shouted, panic threading his voice. They were beginning to realize that what they had assumed was a soft target was anything but. They hadn't expected someone who could anticipate, strike, and vanish, all in a hospital ward full of vulnerable patients. She was no ordinary nurse. Not tonight. One of the intruders tried to flank her from the left. She was already there, silently dropping him with a movement so swift that the man didn't even have time to react. Another approached from the right, thinking sheer numbers would overwhelm her. She met him at the corner of the corridor, using the wall for leverage, and neutralized him in one precise motion. The ward became a deadly chessboard, with her as the only piece the intruders had no strategy for. Machines beeped frantically as oxygen lines were tugged, beds were toppled, and monitors flickered under stray bullets. Yet she moved with a strange grace, guiding patients out of immediate danger while simultaneously countering each threat. Her mind didn't race, it calculated. She didn't panic, it acted. Every attacker who underestimated her fell, often before they understood how or why. Her movements were almost surgical, precise, almost mechanical, but driven by sheer willpower and a refusal to allow harm to come to anyone in her care. From the stairwell, reinforcements arrived. Security guards, armed police, their flashlights cutting through smoke-filled corridors. But even they froze at the scene unfolding before them. Blue scrubs streaked with blood, a nurse moving with terrifying efficiency, bullets pinging off walls around her, and intruders falling one by one. The room seemed suspended in a bizarre, violent choreography that no outsider could fully comprehend. They were late, but she didn't care. She didn't need them. Not yet. The intruders tried to regroup. Some ducked behind overturned beds, firing blindly. Others advanced, trying to pin her down with numbers, but each move they made was anticipated. Each strike was countered. She flowed between them, dodging, striking, covering, and protecting, all at once. The corridor was chaos personified, shouts, gunfire, alarms, but in the middle of it stood her, the calm eye of the storm. And in that calm she found clarity. She could see every angle, every vulnerability, every opportunity. At one point a man grabbed a syringe from a tray, swinging it toward her as a desperate last resort. She sidestepped, knocked him off balance, and in a fluid motion disarmed him. Another tried to fire from a distance, using a patient's bed for cover. She moved faster, her instincts sharper than ever, and neutralized him before he could pull the trigger. Every attacker underestimated her. Every time they paid the price. Blood ran along the floor, mingling with spilled saline. Broken glass from monitors glinted under the flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and smoke. And through it all, she moved like she had rehearsed this nightmare 1,000 times, though no one could have imagined she was capable of this. No one, not the intruders, not the security, not the patients, had seen this side of her before. Then came a lull, a pause. The remaining attackers hesitated, looking at each other nervously. They were trained professionals, but training had limits. They hadn't planned for this. A single nurse, underestimated, unyielding, unstoppable. The ICU, meant to be a place of healing, had become a battlefield, and she was its master. From behind her, she could hear the soft thud of more footsteps, new reinforcements arriving. The sound barely registered in her mind. She had her focus, her awareness, her purpose. She moved again, striking from shadows, using every cover, guiding every patient, countering every move. The ward was a blur of motion, but she remained singularly focused, the center of control amid chaos. Minutes stretched like hours. Every attacker left standing was weaker than the last, more desperate, more panicked. They shouted orders, tried new tactics, but she had anticipated every option. Even as fatigue threatened to creep in, she pushed it aside. She couldn't stop, not until every threat was neutralized, every patient safe, every intruder accounted for. When it ended, silence fell over the ICU. Machines beeped steadily, patients breathed, monitors stabilized. The ward had survived. She stood amidst overturned beds, blood-streaked floors, and broken equipment, and finally allowed herself a slow exhale. Her scrubs clung to her, soaked and torn. Her hands shook slightly, but not from fear, from adrenaline and the sheer intensity of what she had just endured. Outside, reinforcements finally reached the corridor. They froze at the sight, a lone nurse standing, calm and collected, as if the battle had been a routine shift. No one moved for a moment, unsure whether to call out, assist, or simply stand in awe. The intruders were neutralized. The ward was safe, and she had done it alone. And yet, even as her pulse began to slow, she knew this was far from over. The corridor was quiet now, too quiet, in the eerie aftermath of chaos. Her breathing was steady, controlled, almost methodical. Blood still streaked her scrubs, the metallic scent sharp in the air, mingling with antiseptic and smoke. She glanced around the ICU, counting beds, scanning corners, noting every overturned tray and broken monitor. Every attacker who had survived had been neutralized. Every patient was alive. Every machine still beeped. And yet, she didn't move toward relief or celebration. Relief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tonight, there was still work to be done. As she walked, memories surfaced. Not distractions, but fuel. Another place, another night, another life she had tried to leave behind. A time when chaos was not confined to sterile hallways, when people depended on her not just for care, but for survival. She hadn't worn scrubs back then. She had worn heavier gear, layers of protection that weighed down her body but sharpened her senses. Every shift had demanded split-second decisions, every mistake measured in lives lost. She had learned long ago that panic kills faster than bullets, that hesitation could cost not just herself, but everyone relying on her. The thought made her hands tighten slightly around the edge of the tray she now used as cover. The lessons of her past had not faded, they had only been repurposed. Her nursing training had given her empathy, precision, and knowledge of the human body, but her previous life had given her reflexes, anticipation, and survival instincts. Tonight, the two combined. She was both healer and shield, both calm presence and unstoppable force. From the stairwell came a faint noise. Movement. Footsteps, careful, calculated. New attackers or reinforcements? She couldn't be sure, but she didn't hesitate. She adjusted her stance, positioning herself behind a row of overturned beds, scanning angles. Her eyes flicked to every shadow, every corner, every doorway. Her mind cataloged threats and escape routes simultaneously. A man peeked from behind a doorframe, thinking he had the advantage. She moved before he could react, neutralizing him with a swift, precise strike that left no time for panic, no room for error. Another fell. Another tried to advance from the other side, and again, she anticipated, countered, and struck. Every move was controlled, every response rehearsed in instincts honed over years. She paused briefly near the trauma wing. Machines hummed, monitors flashed, oxygen hissed softly from the lines. Patients were breathing, alive. Her own pulse began to slow, but her senses were still sharp. She recalled training from years ago, situations where she had to triage in the midst of active threats, where hesitation meant someone would die. Those experiences weren't stories she shared, not with colleagues, not with anyone. They were tools, weapons of the mind, and tonight they guided her through the chaos that had erupted in what should have been a quiet, predictable night shift. The remaining attackers had regrouped. They whispered to each other, panic evident in their voices despite their training. They were professionals, or at least they had thought they were. Their plans hadn't accounted for her. A single nurse, underestimated, seemingly fragile, had dismantled their operation piece by piece. Confidence had evaporated. Fear crept in. And with fear came mistakes. One of them rushed her from the left, overestimating his advantage. She sidestepped, pivoted, and neutralized him in a motion so fluid it seemed almost choreographed. Another tried to flank from behind using a patient's bed for cover. She anticipated the trajectory, intercepting him with precise timing, leaving him incapacitated before he could fire. Each attacker who underestimated her learned the same lesson. She was not just a nurse. She was something else entirely, something lethal, controlled, unflinching. As she moved down the corridor, her mind flashed back to earlier nights in different hospitals, different countries, different crises. She had treated soldiers with shrapnel wounds, civilians caught in explosions, victims of ambushes in conflict zones. She had learned to act under pressure, to think clearly when chaos erupted around her, to shield others even when she herself was in danger. Nursing had taught her patience, empathy, and precise action. Her past life had taught her how to move like a shadow, strike like lightning, and survive when no one expected her to. And tonight, the combination had turned the ICU into her domain. She checked each bed as she moved. Patients stirred, some frightened, some groggy from sedation, all unaware of how close they had come to harm. She reassured them with a calm hand, a soft word, a steadying touch, even as her mind remained focused on the remaining threats. Her presence was both protection and warning. The attackers hadn't anticipated this. They had assumed she would cower, scream, or flee. She had done none of those things. She had anticipated, calculated, neutralized, protected. Footsteps echoed from the corridor behind her. New figures, backup perhaps, or more attackers. She didn't pause. She moved into position, using the layout of the ward to her advantage, anticipating angles, calculating trajectories, staying one step ahead of any possible threat. Her training, both old and new, guided her. She didn't hesitate. She didn't panic. She acted with purpose, precision, and control. Every movement was deliberate, every strike intentional. The attackers' morale was crumbling. Confusion spread among them. Their initial confidence had been shattered, replaced with doubt. And she didn't let them recover. Every time one of them hesitated, she struck. Every time they regrouped, she was already 2 steps ahead. She controlled the battlefield, even within the narrow corridors of the hospital. Her skill was invisible, almost imperceptible, but deadly. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, the corridor quieted. The remaining attackers were incapacitated or fleeing. Machines beeped steadily again. Patients were alive. Monitors stabilized. The ICU, once a quiet, predictable place, had been transformed into a war zone, and she had emerged unshaken, unbroken, in control of every step, every breath, every life. She exhaled slowly, letting herself feel a fraction of relief, but deep down, she knew this was only the midpoint. The night wasn't over, and whatever came next, she would face it as she had faced every threat before, calmly, decisively, without hesitation. Dawn was just beginning to seep through the hospital windows, painting the ICU in pale gold and silver light. The chaos of the night had finally settled, leaving a strange, almost sacred silence behind. Broken monitors beeped intermittently. Oxygen lines hissed softly. Overturned gurneys and scattered supplies littered the floor, evidence of the storm that had just passed. And amidst it all, she stood in the middle of the ward. Blood streaked across her blue scrubs, hair damp from sweat, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline but otherwise steady. Her face bore the calm mask that had carried her through the night, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else: exhaustion, focus, and an understanding that the events of the last few hours would never leave this place, or her, untouched. Officials had begun to arrive. Hospital administrators, police officers, and emergency response teams now filtered in through the corridors, flashlights cutting through the dim light, radios crackling. They had been briefed, but nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. A lone nurse had neutralized a full-scale assault on the ICU. A single person, underestimated, had saved lives that now teetered on the edge of disaster. Their expressions varied: shock, awe, disbelief. Some simply shook their heads, unable to speak. Others fumbled for radios, calling for backup, seeking confirmation that what they had just witnessed was real. One officer stepped forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the ward before settling on her. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low, measured, as though saying the wrong thing could unravel the delicate reality she had preserved. Who are you?" She turned slowly, letting her gaze sweep across the room. Patients were stabilized. Staff were shaken but alive. The intruders were incapacitated or in police custody. Everything that mattered had been preserved. She met his eyes and spoke quietly, but with a weight that carried authority beyond her title. "I'm a nurse," she said. Silence followed. Not the awkward pause of disbelief, but a silence loaded with tension and respect. He had expected a hero of some other kind, perhaps a trained operative, a soldier, someone with rank or recognition. Not a nurse. Yet here she was, proof that heroism could wear scrubs, wield empathy, and move with precision. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The events of the night had spoken louder than words ever could, but the officer wasn't satisfied. "Your training," he pressed. "This isn't ordinary. You handled that situation with skill. How?" Her hands clenched briefly at her sides. Memories surfaced, not a distraction, but a reminder. She had been somewhere else, once, in a life that demanded more than ordinary courage. There were places where the stakes had been higher, where hesitation could mean death, where saving a single person required a clarity of mind most people never achieved. She had left that life behind to become a nurse, to heal, to protect life rather than destroy. But tonight those old instincts had resurfaced, not for glory, not for recognition, but because she could not allow harm to come to those under her care. "I trained a long time ago," she said softly. "But tonight wasn't about that. It was about the patients, about keeping them alive, about doing my job." The officer nodded slowly. He didn't need more explanation. The calmness in her voice, the precision of her movements, the unwavering focus, it all made sense now. He could see that the skill she displayed was rooted in experience, not chance, in discipline, not luck. And more than that, it was rooted in a commitment that few could match, the refusal to abandon those who relied on her. As she moved through the ward, checking machines, adjusting beds, comforting patients, another officer approached her quietly. "Do the others know?" he asked, nodding toward the hospital staff still trying to process what had happened. "They know now," she replied. Her tone was measured, unshaken. "And they'll remember." The hospital staff watched, wide-eyed, as she moved among them. Nurses who had panicked at first now saw her not just as a colleague, but as something more: a shield, a protector, a force they hadn't understood before. Even the doctors, some of whom had doubted her abilities earlier in the night, were silent. Respect, understanding, and perhaps a touch of awe settled in the room. Outside, the sun rose higher, its golden light spilling into the ward. The hospital, though scarred by the night's events, felt renewed in some strange way. Life had been preserved against overwhelming odds, and she had been the fulcrum upon which it had balanced. She walked slowly down the corridor, every step deliberate. She wasn't seeking recognition or applause. Her job was done. The lives under her care were safe. That was enough. Yet, she could feel it, a subtle shift, among the officers, among her colleagues, among those who had come expecting ordinary responses. There was a dawning realization. She wasn't ordinary. She had never been ordinary. And from this night forward, no one would mistake her for it. Finally, one of the senior officers approached, his voice quieter now, filled with respect rather than command. "You've saved lives tonight, all of them. We need to understand. How? Who taught you this?" She looked around, her gaze briefly meeting the eyes of the patients she had protected, the staff she had guided, the machines she had kept running. Then she returned her attention to him. "Some lessons," she said, voice calm, almost imperceptible. "You don't need to explain. You just live them when they are needed most." The officer nodded. He understood. Not everything could be articulated. Not everything needed to be. Some truths were shown, not told. As the hospital staff began to regroup, rearranging beds and repairing equipment, she took a moment to breathe. The night's events would echo for weeks, months, perhaps years. Stories would be told, some would exaggerate, some would omit. But the essence, the truth, was clear. A nurse had stood alone, defended the vulnerable, and emerged victorious. And in doing so, she had redefined what it meant to be a healer. And though she returned to her work, tending to monitors, adjusting 4S, and checking on patients, there was a quiet understanding in her movements now. No one would underestimate her again. No one would assume she was just another nurse, just another face in blue scrubs. From this night forward, she was more than that. She was proof that courage, skill, and commitment could exist where no one expected it. Quiet, unassuming, but unstoppable when called to action. The hospital had returned to an uneasy calm. The alarms were silenced, the broken monitors replaced or reset, and the ICU had begun the slow process of being restored to order. Nurses moved cautiously, some still shaking from what they had witnessed. Doctors whispered in small groups, comparing accounts of the night's chaos. Everyone had a story to tell, everyone except her. She moved among them quietly, checking 4S, straightening beds, and confirming patient vitals. Blood still stained her scrubs, a stark reminder of what had occurred, but she walked with the calm confidence of someone who had already reconciled with the storm. Outside, the sun now fully rose, spilling light across the hospital facade. Helicopters lingered in the distance, fading into the horizon. Media reports would call it an incident, a break-in, a miracle. But she knew the truth. Miracles were earned, not random. And tonight, survival had been the result of skill, awareness, and the refusal to back down. She paused by a patient's bed, adjusting the oxygen mask gently. The elderly man blinked up at her, confused but alive. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Saving lives was never about recognition. Yet these moments, the subtle human ones, were what mattered most. The adrenaline that had driven her through the night began to fade, replaced by a calm satisfaction, quiet but profound. The hospital staff had begun to gather in the main corridor, murmuring about the lone nurse who had turned the tide. Whispers of disbelief mixed with admiration filled the air. The officer who had questioned her earlier approached once more. His eyes reflected respect, acknowledgement, and an understanding that her deeds had transcended ordinary expectation. "You've saved every patient here," he said softly. "No one expected this." She shook her head slightly, the faintest hint of a smile curving her lips. "I didn't expect to need it either," she replied. Her voice was calm, steady, yet carried weight. It was not pride that spoke, but quiet authority. She did what had to be done. She protected life. She acted. And that was enough. The intruders, now restrained and waiting for law enforcement, could never have predicted her. They had underestimated her from the first second they set foot in the hospital. That underestimation had been their downfall. Their arrogance, their confidence in their training, had blinded them to the reality that one individual, seemingly ordinary, could defy expectation with discipline, skill, and determination. As she walked through the ward one last time, she caught sight of her reflection in a polished monitor screen. Blood-streaked, sweat-slicked, eyes sharp and focused. For the first time, she allowed herself a brief acknowledgement of what had transpired. Not pride, she never sought it, but recognition. Recognition that she had faced a storm, faced violence, faced chaos, and emerged unbroken. That the life she had chosen, the life of a healer, could coexist with the instincts of a protector. The hospital slowly returned to routine. Nurses resumed their rounds. Doctors began procedures. Patients stabilized further. And yet, everyone knew things had changed. The quiet ICU had witnessed extraordinary courage, and the lesson was clear: never underestimate those whose purpose is to protect life. Strength does not always announce itself. Heroism does not always wear a uniform of armor. Sometimes it wears scrubs. Sometimes it moves silently, with precision and with unwavering focus. She returned to her station, checking charts and ensuring each patient was stable. The world outside the hospital continued unaware of the chaos that had unfolded within these walls. But she carried it with her, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the responsibility and power of her role. She had been underestimated. She had been doubted. And she had responded, not with arrogance, but with skill, discipline, and courage. That alone would ensure she was never underestimated again. Moments later, one of the younger nurses approached her hesitantly. How did you do it?" the nurse whispered, eyes wide with awe. She looked down at her colleague calmly, a soft, measured smile forming. "You focus, you protect, you move when it's needed, and you never let fear make the decisions for you." The words resonated far beyond the ICU walls. They were a lesson not just in survival, but in courage, discipline, and purpose. The younger nurse nodded, absorbing every syllable, understanding that bravery often hides in plain sight, in quiet, steadfast action. As the sun rose fully, illuminating the hospital with warmth and clarity, she finally allowed herself to take a deep breath. The patients were safe, the ward was secure, she had survived, and the world, however unaware, had been reminded that heroism comes in many forms. Sometimes it comes quietly, without fanfare, yet leaves an impact far greater than any overt display of power. She adjusted her scrubs, wiped her hands, and prepared for the next patient. The night was over, but the lesson remained. From this day forward, no one would underestimate her again. No one would assume she was simply a nurse, because she had proven that when courage, skill, and purpose converge, even the ordinary can achieve the extraordinary. And as she moved down the hall, attending to the next patient, checking monitors, adjusting 4S, and offering calm reassurance, she knew the truth. It wasn't about recognition, it wasn't about glory, it was about life. The lives she had protected, the patients she had saved, and the wards she had defended. That was enough. That would always be enough. The story of the night would spread, distorted by media reports, exaggerated by witnesses, whispered in awe by colleagues. But she didn't care. She didn't need the world to understand. What mattered was the truth she lived, the lives she saved, and the lesson that echoed quietly, yet powerfully: courage can appear where no one expects it. And when it does, it changes everything. After everything she went through, and the lives she saved, one thing is clear: courage isn't loud, it's decisive. If you were inspired by her bravery, imagine what happens when ordinary people rise to extraordinary challenges. Don't just watch. Hit that like button to honor the quiet heroes in your life. Subscribe to see more unbelievable stories of courage, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next shocking tale. Share this video with friends who think heroes always wear armor, because sometimes they wear scrubs. And comment below: if you were in her shoes, would you have the courage to stand when the world expected you to fall?